the evening of the assassination, the body of President Kennedy was returned to Washington. The autopsy was performed at Bethesda Medical Center, a naval institution. And there has always been a question about the practices of the men who performed what was one of the most important and confusing autopsies of the 20th century.
Would Milton Halpern in New York have been a good choice to do the autopsy?
I know this directly from Milton. This is not hearsay. He had his bag packed, and he had already contacted 2 other top forensic pathologists to see if they would be available. All of the top forensic pathologists in the United States were within 1 hour drive or flying time from D.C. Not one of them was called upon. The autopsy should have been done, legally speaking, in Dallas, and there was a forensic pathologist, Earl Rose. He was there to assume jurisdiction and to do the autopsy. He was pushed up against a wall and threatened, hands on guns, a lot of expletives and so on. He followed them out the driveway, and they took the body illegally out of Dallas in violation of the laws of Dallas and the state of Texas.
There were 2 Navy pathologists, Commander James Humes and his associate J. Thornton Boswell.
These 2 military pathologists who had never done a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. And this is something that really has to be emphasized to every American. I don't care, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. This is your president. And you've got multiple gunshot wounds to determine angle, trajectory, range, sequence, and then you got to correlate with the multiple gunshot wounds in Connally. This is a formidable task that would have required 2 or 3 major forensic pathologists to undertake. So they called Humes and Boswell.
They realized they were over their head. They called in an expert from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, a guy named Pierre Fink. Dr. Humes and Boswell started the autopsy before their forensics consultant even got there. They took the brain out. Obviously, some key clues would have been lost by doing that. But they realized they were in over their head, so they asked to have a medical examiner, because Dr. Fink, who was a forensic pathologist, wasn't doing autopsy. He hadn't done one in more than 2 years. So they asked for permission to bring in somebody who knew what they were doing. Permission was denied.
After Air Force One left Dallas for Washington, 2 of the key doctors who had tried to save Kennedy's life at Parkland Hospital held a press conference. They were Dr. Malcolm Perry and Dr. Kemp Clark.
What were the 2 major points of evidence revealed by Kemp Clark and Malcolm Perry at the press conference?
Dr. Perry performed the tracheotomy to help Kennedy breathe. And at a press conference right after the failed resuscitation efforts in Dallas, he was asked, he said, well, where was the bullet? And he said the bullet looked like it was coming at him. He had an entrance wound in the throat.
Kemp Clark was the head of neurosurgery at Parkland. He said that the president had a gaping wound in the occipital parietal area. That's, the right rear of the head. And so the description he gave of that was entirely consistent with an exit wound. And he made that clear in the press conference.
What Clark and Perry both revealed at that press conference would indicate an assassin from the front, but no news footage has survived. Although Assistant White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff's statement that day seems to support this conclusion.
Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
President Kennedy, we are now informed, was shot in the right temple. It was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, said Dr. George Berkeley, the White House medical officer.
We have a transcript today of what they said at the press conference. So it's White House transcript 1327C. That's a very important historical document because the Secret Service confiscated the videotapes from the local TV stations.
The Secret Service also lied to the Warren Commission about there being no recordings or transcripts of the news conference. There is, however, a surviving clip of Dr. Perry recorded not long afterward where he confirms having seen a large wound in the back of the head.
Arriving at the emergency room, Dr. Carrickle had placed a tube in the president's trachea to assist his breathing, but there was a neck wound anteriorly and a large wound of his head in the right posterior area.
The day after the shooting and the Parkland press conference, Dr. Perry was seen by nurse Audrey Bell, who had been with him in the operating room.
Saturday morning, when I got over there, Dr. Perry came up to the office. I said, "You look awful. Did you get any sleep last night?" And he said, Well, not too much between the calls from Bethesda that came in during the night. I said, what about? He said, whether that was an entrance wound or an exit wound in the throat. He said they were wanting me to change my mind.
In his Warren Commission testimony, he basically retracted what he had said, and they forced him to back down and sort of intimidated him on the witness stand. It was really quite embarrassing for me as a physician to see how someone else who was telling the truth was basically forced to recant his own opinion.
In 1975, Dr. Shires hired me on the faculty at the University of Washington in the cardiac surgery division. So I got to know Malcolm when I joined the faculty. We developed a professional relationship, and we would operate together on complex cases. And I was particularly interested in Dr. Perry's position with the JFK assassination because he did the tracheotomy on him after he was shot. The problem is that Malcolm categorically refused to ever discuss the assassination. And he wouldn't answer my questions about that neck wound. And then one night, after we had operated together for many hours on a complex case, we were sitting in the surgeon's lounge alone, drinking coffee, and I once again asked him about that neck wound. And this time, he said, it was an entrance wound, unquestionably an entrance wound. I took that admission as a given in confidence, so it was sort of tacitly in confidence. And then when he testified in front of the House Select Committee on Assassinations a year later, he once again said that it was consistent with an exit wound, which of course was required if the single bullet theory would hold water. One of the main reason he changed his testimony and publicly agreed it was an exit wound is a Secret Service agent put the pressure on him, and that person was Elmer Moore. He apparently was also in charge of getting the doctors at Parkland, in addition to Dr. Perry, to change their testimony and agree that there was no big hole in the back of Kennedy's head and that the bullet wound in the neck was an exit wound. In 1970, Elmer Moore was the head of the Secret Service office in Seattle. And a graduate student named Jim Gockenauer became friends with him. And he admitted to Gockenauer that he regretted putting pressure on Dr. Perry.
So I asked him directly. I said, Mr. Moore, did you pressure Dr. Perry? He stopped for a minute and he says, well, I was ordered to do that. He expanded on it and he said that Inspector Kelly had ordered him to talk with Perry and convince him that it could be either an exit or an entry wound, not an entry wound. And I thought it was pretty interesting that he would admit to something that's pretty close to a felony.
Charles Crenshaw, a third-year resident, was in the emergency room at Parkland that day. He, too, later said in public that he felt the wounds in Kennedy originated from the front.
From here through.
Charles Crenshaw wrote a book, Conspiracy of Silence, in the wake of the film JFK, saying, look, I was at Parkland Hospital, I saw Kennedy, was involved in the treatment, and Kennedy's wounds were not consistent with a shot from above and behind because he had a defect involving the right rear of his head.
I looked at the wound again. I wanted to know and remember this the rest of my life. And the rest of my life, I will always know he was shot from the front.
Arlen Specter was a Yale Law School graduate working in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office when he was asked to serve on the Warren Commission. Specter was placed in charge of medical evidence. And when he questioned Humes and Boswell before the commission, they said 2 shots hit the president, 1 in the neck, 1 low in the rear skull, entirely supporting the commission's final conclusions. However, when interviewed by the Assassination Records Review Board, Humes and Boswell admitted to meeting with Specter 8 to 10 times in advance of their testimony. And it is important to note that the wound drawings presented in the Warren report were created in the days before that testimony and were not based on the autopsy photos. Instead, Harold Rydberg, the 23-year-old head of the medical illustration department at Bethesda, was given verbal instructions by Humes and Boswell, who said, "We'll tell you what to draw."
Warren Commission heard testimony from a number of witnesses, including Parkland doctors, by the way, and including a Secret Service agent, Clint Hill, that the right rear quadrant of the head was missing.
Hill was the only Secret Service agent to run to the presidential limousine during the shooting. He later said there was blood and brain tissue hurtling back over the trunk of the car. And as he approached the president, he saw a large wound in the rear of the skull, which he could see through with no brain there.
The two FBI agents at the autopsy, Frank O'Neill and James Seibert, they reported what they heard during the autopsy, what they heard the pathologists say, specifically Dr. Humes. They were interviewed by Arlen Specter in early 1964. He proceeded to write very unfavorable comments about them in a summary memo for the record. We know with confidence that why he didn't like what they had to say, because they were providing evidence that the single bullet theory could not be true.
This was as far as the investigation would go. Neither Seibert nor O'Neill were asked to testify for the Warren Commission, and their written notes became classified. In 1997, their depositions were taken by the Assassination Records Review Board.
Both Seibert and O'Neill were shown the photographs of the back of JFK's head, the autopsy photographs that are the most controversial. And they both said that they didn't see anything like that at the autopsy. O'Neill had said, it looks like it's been doctored. I don't mean the photo's been doctored. It looks like the head has been put back together, you know, by embalmers and then photographed. That was what he said under oath. Seibert did not remember drawing a diagram of the wound for the House committee, so he drew a new one for the review board. And it's one of our most important wound diagrams, and it shows what could only be an exit defect in the right rear of the skull.
There was a piece about the size of a 3x5 card that was missing.
In 1979, the House Select Committee report stated that 26 people present at the autopsy in Bethesda all disagreed with the Parkland doctor's description of Kennedy's head wound.
When you went through the declassified affidavits that the House Select Committee prepared, what did you find about the alleged differences between the Parkland and Bethesda witnesses on this issue?
Not only were we allowed to see their statements, but we were allowed to see the sketches where they had drawn the big hole on the back of the head. And this was totally opposite of what the House Select Committee had told us.
When the Assassination Records Review Board came along, out come those witness statements, out come the diagrams, and lo and behold, it turns out that the witnesses at the autopsy all agreed with the doctors at Dallas that the defect involved the rear of the head. And the summary statement basically misrepresented that truth. They basically lied about what was there.
To make this even worse, if one looks at the official back of the head photo, there appears to be nothing missing, but there likely was something. This was a piece of bone that did not arrive in Washington until after the autopsy was over. And if it came from the back of Kennedy's skull, it created even more problems for that picture.
The Harper fragment was a piece of fresh skull bone that was found in Dealey Plaza, not on the day of the assassination, but later, by Billy Harper.
And reached down and picked it up, and at that time knew that I had something that most likely was significant.
It was found in a position where the FBI said that was to the left and rear of where Jack Kennedy was when he was assassinated. It was then taken in by this medical student into his professors, and they looked at it and they said it looked like it was occipital bone, which is back here.
It measured approximately 3 by 2 inches and therefore would have fit neatly in the rear skull wound visualized by Dr. McClelland. This bone was given to the FBI on the 25th after the autopsy report had been written by Dr. Humes. The FBI gave it to Kennedy's physician, Admiral Berkeley, at which point it disappears. All we have today are the pictures taken of it in Dallas. This bit of evidence raises the question, if the rear of the skull in the official autopsy was mostly filled in with bone fragments found in the limousine, where does the Harper fragment fit?
Never realized Kennedy was so dangerous to the establishment. Is that why?
Well, that's the real question, isn't it? Why? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the mafia. Keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, prevents them from asking the most important question, why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who?
At age 34, Congressman John F. Kennedy realized that if he were going to challenge for a seat in the Senate, he needed to broaden his knowledge of foreign affairs. So he decided in 1951 to take a 7-week journey to the Middle East and Asia, accompanied by his sister Patricia and his brother Robert. During their stop in Vietnam, Kennedy planned to meet with Edmund Gullion. Gullion was a career diplomat who had once helped Kennedy write a foreign policy speech. Kennedy and his brother made it a point to seek him out, meeting at a rooftop restaurant in Saigon.
And it was one of the most important experiences in his pre-presidential career. A war was going on, France versus the Viet Minh. 80% of their military material was coming from the United States.
And because of this, Kennedy wanted to see what the status of this brutal colonial war really was.
When he met with the French generals, that's when he formed the impression that the war was going well, because that was, what the French generals were telling him. I think his opinion started to change when he met Edmund Gullion. He had told Kennedy that the French were actually losing the war and that the war was unwinnable. In fact, he said that if the U.S. were to replace the French, that the U.S. would also lose the war.
Because Gullion made JFK understand that nothing short of independence would ever win in Vietnam. And if independence had to come at the hands of the communists, they would go with the communists rather than stay a colony of any independent force.
Gullion's warning that America was backing an imminent French defeat caused Kennedy to begin a 6-year crusade to formulate an alternative foreign policy, one opposed to the confrontational with us or against us advocated by President Harry Truman. Truman had broken away from his predecessor Franklin Roosevelt's strategy of cooperation with the USSR, creating a worldwide Cold War face-off, later amplified by Dwight Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles.
Can you describe the 1953 letter that JFK sent to Dulles about Indochina?
He sent a letter to John Foster Dulles, who was then Secretary of State, asking him 47 questions about American support for France in Vietnam. One of those questions was, what specific evidence is there, Mr. Secretary, that France is winning the war?
Foster Dulles' eventual answer to this letter was codenamed Operation Vulture. Vice President Richard Nixon was the main lobbyist for the air operation in Congress. Planned as a massive air armada, it featured scores of bombers and fighter planes designed to save the French position at what would become the fatal siege of Dien Bien Phu in the spring of 1954. Vulture included the possibility of dropping 2 or 3 atomic bombs.
The U.S. leadership, John Foster Dulles in particular, took the initiative to offer the French the use of the nuclear weapons, and even the French themselves said, this is going too far for us, this is going too far, and we can't be a party to this.
Kennedy spoke on the Senate floor in strong opposition to Vulture.
No amount of American military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere, and at the same time nowhere. An enemy of the people which is the sympathy and covert support of the people.
When Eisenhower could not get the British to sign on to the project, he rejected it. And as Ambassador Gullion predicted, France lost its colonial war in Indochina. Kennedy gave his support to the Liberal presidential candidate, Adlai Stevenson, and began giving speeches confronting the shared Cold War orthodoxies of both parties.
The determination of people to control their national destinies. In my opinion, the tragic failure of both Republican and Democratic administrations to comprehend the nature of this revolution has reaped a bitter harvest today, and it is by rights and by necessity a major foreign policy campaign issue that has nothing to do with anti-communism.
Even for the liberal Stevenson, that was too much. His office wired Kennedy and specifically requested that he make no more foreign policy statements in any way associated with the campaign. The next year, in 1957, Kennedy found the perfect opportunity to assault Foster Dulles, Nixon, and Eisenhower, and to establish an alternative American foreign policy.
Algeria became the last stand for France in its imperium. There was about 1,200,000 French citizens who were resident in North Africa generally, but in Algeria specifically, called Pieds Noirs. And they were completely behind the war effort, and they were threatening French politicians. And what had happened in the French officer corps that was very, very critical and very dangerous was that after the defeat in Vietnam, a secret organization called the OAS, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, threatened the government in Paris that if there was any withdrawal or any negotiations with the Algerian nationalists, that government would be overthrown.
The Algerian conflict, fought guerrilla style, devolved into terror, torture, and atrocities on both sides. France escalated the war, a point-counterpoint of terror act followed by retaliation.
Can you tell us, how did support in Algeria differ from Vietnam?
In Algeria, it was support in a political sense. We supplied them through NATO with some, amount of weaponry and aircraft, but not to the extent that we had in Vietnam. It was a war that was so violent and so lethal that the Americans stood aside. They supported France, but they didn't want to be involved.
It was against this backdrop that Kennedy chose to express his differences with the monster that Dulles and Eisenhower had created, one now staggering out of control. He attacked both Washington and Paris for not seeing in Algeria a reprise of the 1954 French collapse in Vietnam.
I am introducing a resolution which I believe outlines the best hopes for peace and of settlement in Algeria, to achieve a solution which will recognize the independent personality of Algeria and establish the basis for a settlement interdependent with France and the neighboring nations.
Very few people, none with his prominence, had been willing to say what he said, which was to challenge a kind of default Eurocentrism in American foreign policy, to challenge the kind of Europe-first outlook, especially toward conflicts in the colonial world. And Kennedy could even say, look, this isn't even doing France any favors.
That speech earned him the vitriol not only of Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller, Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, etc., but also Democrats like Adlai Stevenson, because they saw that colonial empire as the only thing that was holding the European economy together. And Europe was the bulwark against communism. So we had to support their colonial aspirations and ambitions in Africa. My uncle said, no, we shouldn't be doing that. That is going to, in the long run, weaken us. And in any event, it's against every American ideal. We should be supporting democracy wherever it pops up in the world.
Well, Joe Kennedy, his father, who had a very significant role in his son's career at all times, took him aside and surprisingly said to him, one day people are going to see that you really knew what you were talking about. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The Fourth Republic fell, de Gaulle came in, and he immediately initiated talks with the Algerian nationalists.
In the archipelago nation of Indonesia, President Sukarno had fought a long battle for independence from the Dutch colonists. A self-styled nationalist, he balanced the country's Communist Party, the PKI, with his military, attempting to create what he termed guided democracy. Partly as a reaction to the CIA-backed overthrow of democratic governments in Guatemala and Iran, Sukarno and other Third World leaders arranged a conference in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, beginning what became known as the Non-Aligned Movement.
And how did Kennedy's approach to the non-aligned movement differ from Dulles'?
John Foster Dulles had said that the policy of neutrality was immoral. John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles came from a Christian background, and they felt, what they had to say was good enough for the rest of the world, that they knew more than the president. There were things they didn't tell Eisenhower that they were doing under his administration.
In 1958, Indonesian military dissidents rebelled against Sukarno, and at Eisenhower's direction, the CIA initiated plans to assist them in overthrowing their president.
The United States, under John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, saw support for the rebellions as a means of weakening Sukarno, potentially breaking up the archipelago and weakening the Indonesian Communist Party. And so for more than a year, the United States carried out what up to that point was the largest and most destructive covert operation of the Asian Cold War, in which thousands of U.S. troops were involved, in which millions of dollars in weapons and supplies were given to the regional rebellions, and in which thousands of people were killed.
A CIA pilot, Alan Pope, was shot down during the operation, exposing U.S. involvement, and the coup attempt failed.
Kennedy, looking at the broad scope of American history, American foreign policy was fundamentally neutral. World War I was the great exception until, of course, the Second World War. He saw nothing wrong with it. He could also draw from the experiences he'd had traveling in the Middle East in the early 1950s. He could draw from the example of Ireland during the Second World War, which had achieved a kind of difficult and controversial neutrality.
Kennedy's interest in self-determination for the Third World led him to become chairman of the U.S. Senate African Affairs Subcommittee in 1958.
We had a delegation from Kenya come to our house on the Cape, and the head of that delegation was a man named Tom Mboya, who was a great labor leader in Africa. Around 1959, the British said to Kenya, "We're going to leave. We'll give you 5 years to figure out how to rule this country." And Mboya looked around and said, "There's not a single black child in this country who has a college degree." So he wrote letters to every college in America, and he got 100 of them, including Harvard, to commit to give a scholarship to one Kenyan child, and he would choose the smartest kids in the country. My uncle was so impressed by him that he wrote him a $100,000 check to bring these kids over. 2004, the Democratic Convention was in Boston, and I was asked to speak on the environment. Right after I spoke, there was a young first-term, first-year Democratic senator from Illinois who nobody had ever heard of, who gave a speech that blew the roof off the convention.
The hope of a mill worker's son who dares to defy the odds. The hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too.
And I asked him about his life. I knew nothing about him, and he said that his father was Kenyan. And I said, "Oh, have you ever heard of Tom Mboya?" And he said to me, "Tom Mboya is the reason I'm in this country, because his father was the first kid brought over on the airlift."
Kennedy was now the man to see for visiting African dignitaries. During the 1960 campaign against Richard Nixon, JFK mentioned Africa nearly 500 times. The night of the election, the Algerian rebels listened by radio from their hillside camps, hoping their American friend would win the seesaw battle. It came as a shock to many, including Eisenhower and Nixon, when Kennedy won a narrow victory.
JFK case was such a mass of confusion that the Warren Commission version of the firing sequence differed from both the FBI's and the CIA's. Although it never specified the order of the shots, the Warren report had one bullet going through Kennedy and Governor Connally, another missing the car, hitting a bystander on Commerce Street, James Tague, and the final shot hitting Kennedy in the head. The FBI concluded that all 3 bullets struck inside the car, 2 hitting Kennedy and 1 hitting Connally. The CIA analysis said that the first shot did not come from the 6th floor window, and further, that 2 shooters were involved. Their photographic analysis, based on the Zapruder film, was closely held. Records showing that it only went to director John McCone. Like the FBI analysis, the Warren Commission either never received it or chose to ignore it.
The Warren Commission put itself in a straitjacket. They could not possibly allow more than 3 shots, because 4 shots or more would have clearly indicated conspiracy, and they were not going there.
When Oswald, under the Warren Commission's conclusion, had the best opportunity to line up, and as the cars approached on Houston Street, then getting closer and closer, and there you are, Mr. Oswald, it's coming right at you, but you wait until the cars turn, and they're going down Elm Street on a diagonal downward, and the vision is partially blocked by foliage on the trees, and that's when you shoot. So somehow the first shot, which he should have been better prepared for, he missed, and then the second shot is the one that ultimately they said was the hero of the single bullet theory that went into Kennedy's back and produced 7 wounds in him and Connally, and then the third shot hit, according to them, Kennedy in the head. As they began to reflect upon this into March, April of 1964, they were faced with a seemingly impossible physical incongruity because they had a problem with the chronology of the Zapruder film, which showed that Connally is hit about 1.5 seconds after Kennedy is hit. Well, the problem was the best marksman they could find, not worrying about re-aiming and repositioning a moving target, 2.3 seconds for this piece of junk, most inferior weapon of the genre, the Mannlicher Carcano. Now 2.3 seconds versus 1.5 seconds. Arlen Specter, junior legal counsel, later to become district attorney and then U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. He is the one that gave birth to the single bullet theory. Aha! What if one bullet made all 7 wounds? What if one bullet went into Kennedy's back and came out his neck, and then went into Connally's back, through his chest, out the front of his chest, into the back of his right wrist, out the front of his right wrist, and into his left thigh? And that is the single bullet theory, which Mark Lane, I think, was the first one to dub as the magic bullet theory.
CE 399 was the magic bullet. And all government investigations so far have treated that bullet as absolutely foundational to this case. Never doubted that it was involved in the case, and never really looked at the provenance of the bullet.
The other problem is the lack of damage to the bullet after going through 2 men, smashing 2 bones, and making 7 wounds. Dr. Joseph Dolce was a much-honored battlefield surgeon during World War II. He worked for the Warren Commission.
And so they gave us the original rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano, plus 100 bullets, 6.5 millimeters. And we went and we shot the cadaverist, and in every instance, the front or the tip of the bullet was smashed. Under no circumstances do I feel that this bullet could hit the wrist and still not be deformed.
Dolce came to believe that 2 bullets had struck Connally. Since Arlen Specter pre-screened the medical witnesses for the commission, Dolce's name is not in the Warren report, and his testimony is not in the volumes. In September of 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations tried again to link CE 399 to the case through the work of Dr. Vincent Gwynn, and a test called neutron activation analysis, which attempted to show that all fragments and CE399 came from only 2 bullets.
Robert Blakey, who was in charge of the investigation for the House, claimed that their work with neutron activation analysis was the linchpin of the case against Oswald.
Partly because of the renewed interest in the JFK case, this test came under severe criticism.
People who had deep experience in neutron activation analysis at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory re-looked at that and said that those fragments that came out might not have even come from Mannlicher Carcano bullets, and they could have come from any one of 5 bullets, not the 2. So that has been completely debunked, so much so that neutron activation analysis, which the FBI used to use in prosecutions, was given up more than 10 years ago. They don't do that anymore because they know that it's junk science.
Without this test, there is no proof that CE399 and the fragments in Governor Connolly's wrist are from the same bullet. And even Connolly refused to accept the single bullet theory.
Did the Warren Commission do experiments with the alleged Oswald rifle on skulls?
They did human skull experiments in 1964 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. They filled human skulls with human equivalent material, and they were testified to under oath by Larry Sturtevant, the House Select Committee. He says, as you can see, every skull, all 10 of them, moved away from the rifle.
The trajectory from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository to Z312 or Z313, the trajectory would have resulted in a blowout through the face, and this was confirmed even by the government's own data.
And photos from the autopsy clearly show Kennedy's face to be intact. The Warren Commission was aware of something else that was wrong with their evidence.
All kinds of ballistic tests show that the bullets, in fact, came from that rifle. That was his rifle. You took a picture of him with it. His palm prints and fingerprints were all over the school book depository.
You have been misinformed. The ballistic test did not prove anything at all.
This is a weapon that was used, a rather well-worn military rifle.
Is this really true, or is it a myth that has been allowed to assume the status of accepted fact since few have challenged it?
Is the rifle in evidence today the same rifle the commission said Oswald ordered through the mail?
The rifle that Lee Oswald allegedly ordered under an alias of Alex Heidel was obtained through Klein's Sporting Goods store in Chicago as a mail order. Got it out of American Rifleman magazine. He wrote on the coupon he wanted a 36-inch model Mannlicher Carcano 6.5 millimeter for $19.95. Robert Frazier was one of the examiners. He was a firearms expert for the FBI, and he testified that he did measure it, and the measurement was 40.2 inches in length from barrel to stock. There's a 4.2-inch difference in the one he ordered versus what they found in the book depository.
Klein's may have indeed delivered a different Mannlicher Carcano model to Oswald, but there are other anomalies to this story. The model that Oswald ordered showed these strap attachment points on the bottom of the barrel and stock.
In the photograph is Lieutenant Carl Day with the Dallas Police Department bringing a rifle out of the book depository. One of the straps at the back of the gun is on the left side of the stock, embedded in the stock. That's clearly not the rifle that was ordered, or at least appears in the Klein's Sporting Goods store.
The straps shown in the so-called backyard photos are on the bottom and not on the side of the stock.
Marina Oswald took backyard photographs of Lee Oswald holding a rifle and a pistol on his hip. And in that first photograph that she took 3 of, Commission Exhibit 133A and 133B show a ring on the ring finger of the right hand. 133C, the ring appears on the left hand. In fact, the Dallas police showed Lee Oswald one of the pictures while he was still in custody. He said, "That's my face, but I don't remember ever having that picture taken of me."
There's also a question of how Oswald received the rifle.
If the rifle was sent from Klein's to the post office box rented under the name Lee Harvey Oswald, using the alias of A.J. Heidel on the coupon, it would have been sent back immediately, because Oswald's name was the only one on the post office box. He was the only one authorized to receive mail. Marina didn't even have her name wasn't even on there. So that rifle was addressed to a person who didn't have the authority to have any mail received at that box. It should have been sent back.
But after all these questions are asked, the underlying mystery remains. Why would anyone use a rifle in an assassination knowing there was a paper trail that would lead right back to them?
Was there a palm print found on the rifle?
The foremost fingerprint expert the FBI had, Sebastian Latona, took that rifle and attempted to lift prints off of the rifle, the stock and or the barrel. He testified to the Warren Commission that he found no usable prints anywhere on that rifle, on the metal or the stock. But yet, Lieutenant Day in Dallas, before the rifle went to Washington, said he found a partial palm print on the trigger guard on the left side and a partial print underneath the stock on the barrel. But Sebastian Latona said there was no evidence of a lift that even been attempted.
No partials at all?
Nothing that he could use in court. There has to be 8 points of identification. He found nothing that would match that.
I was able to enter this building, along with the Secret Service, and shoot exclusive footage of finding of the assassin's gun, dusting it for fingerprints.
Tom Allier was the first reporter that made it up to the 6th floor. I would say that he was a friend to the Dallas police because he worked as a photographer on many crime scenes, and he probably knew most of these officers that were there. They found the shells that were ejected from the rifle, and they found some, looked like someone's lunch.
Allier described the location of these 3 shell casings were almost in a line facing the same direction within 4 or 5 inches of the front of the building. When you eject them from a rifle, they're not going to land like that. They're going to be everywhere. Captain Fritz was brought over, and he picked up these 3 shell casings and held them out in his hand, flat. Allier took motion picture film of it.
This was before Dallas police photographer Robert Studebaker took pictures of the shells on the floor. So clearly, that was a staged photo. The X's indicate where Tom Allier recalls the original placement. The Warren Commission never interviewed Tom Allier, and they never questioned if the crime scene had been altered.
How important is chain of custody in a legal proceeding?
Chain of custody basically refers to the integrity of evidence. If I pick up a piece of evidence and I transfer it to somebody else for holding or processing, my name is the first name on this list. The second person who touches this and takes possession of it is next. And if you don't do that, there's no way to prove that the evidence you collected on day 1 is the same one you get on day 25 when you go to court.
Can you walk us through the Magic Bullets chain of custody from the Parkland employees to the Secret Service to the FBI?
Well, the Magic Bullet was supposedly found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital and went through several hands before it got to the Secret Service. Richard Johnson was the first Secret Service agent to handle it, and he carried it back to Washington, D.C. When he got back to Washington, D.C., he gave it to the chief of the Secret Service, who was James Rowley. And at the White House, James Rowley gave it to Elmer Lee Todd, and Todd then took it to the FBI lab and gave it to Robert Frazier. We have interesting information produced by John Hunt, a private citizen who went to the archives on 4 or 5 occasions to track down the story about the Magic Bullet. And what he found was truly astounding.
He practically moved into the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They allowed him to set up a desk with a computer and his own scanner. And he also did something different. He didn't interview policemen and FBI people, and he wasn't swayed by their excuses. He went straight to, this is what you told, and you signed your name.
Working with the FBI and Warren Commission documents, John Hunt asked the most basic question. Was CE-399 in evidence the same bullet that was found on the stretcher?
At 7:30 at night, this is the day of the assassination, November 22nd, 1963, a bullet appears in the record, and it's signed for by Robert Frazier, who is the main investigator at the FBI lab. And it's not just one document. There are multiple documents that indicate that Fraser signed for a bullet at 7:30 that night. Now, here's where things get interesting. Elmer Lee Todd received the bullet at the White House from Chief of the Secret Service, James Rowley. And Todd documents very clearly in writing that he got this bullet at 8:50 p.m. How is that possible? How can Robert Fraser receive the bullet in the lab at 7:30 from Elmer Lee Todd when Todd didn't get the bullet until 8:50?
You would think that they would have handled it, like it would have been gold going to the bank. There it is in the record. Someone is lying about when they got the bullet.
It gets worse, though. Todd initialed that bullet, the one that he got at 8:50. And everyone else who touched the bullet after that initialed it too, including Robert Fraser. I went to the archives to look at this bullet, and specifically what we want to know is, do we see Todd's initials on this bullet? He said he initialed the bullet. It is not there. Todd's initials are not on the magic bullet.
I was very interested in finding out what the review board would show us about this. So we began scouring their evidence, and we found out something very interesting. We found out that the Warren report had from an FBI a report saying that the guys that found the bullet later identified that as the bullet they'd seen. The internal record didn't show that at all. The internal record said this bullet didn't look like that bullet at all. But the FBI had reported to the Warren Commission that it did. It lied. We then talked to the FBI agent that was supposed to have carried that bullet around. His name was Bardwell Odom. I got Bardwell Odom on the phone. I sent him the documents that said that he had done this. He said, I never had that bullet. I never showed any bullet to anyone. If I'd had the bullet, there'd be a 302. I would have filed a report, particularly in that era. Everybody was very uptight about getting everything right. So we scoured for 302 reports. His name appears nowhere in the record. This is just something that the FBI invented.
In 1966, Josiah Thompson, who authored 6 Seconds in Dallas, interviewed O.P. Wright, who was head of maintenance at Parkland Hospital and who had handled the bullet. He showed him a photograph of the magic bullet, which has a rounded tip. And O.P. Wright said, no, it wasn't like that.
Wright, who worked as a policeman, he knew bullets. And he said, no, the bullet that we found at Parkland had a pointed tip, and he just pulled one out of his drawer that had a pointed tip and showed it, and it looks nothing like 399.
It's conceivable that some mysterious bullet showed up from who knows where. Todd did not initial it, and it ended up in the FBI lab as the magic bullet. But then we have the second bullet that arrives at 8:50. Is this possibly the pointed bullet that was seen by O.P. Wright in Dallas and that then disappeared? We don't have any idea where it is today. That scenario would fit the known facts.
So it appears that a different bullet was found on that stretcher than 399. 399 shows up after it's been to the FBI lab, and one can only surmise that somewhere in the FBI they realized they had to close the loop on Oswald's guilt, and so they just switched it out. Because none of the 4 people, either the guys at Parkland or the 2 Secret Service agents, could identify the bullet. The guy who is supposed to have gotten confirmation that they did identify the bullet said he never did it, and the record supports that. So there's good reason to be very suspicious about the magic bullet.
The chain of custody doesn't start from the laboratory. It starts from the crime scene. Each piece of evidence should be photographed, documented, and preserved properly. From the scene, evidence collected, sent to the laboratory. We have to keep the chain of custody when they enter the lab. Who examined, who did the further analysis, and each step have to maintain until submit to the court. If this chain broke, then my evidence become inadmissible.
Sunday, November 24th, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald has been in detention for 2 days after he was caught in a movie theater just an hour after the assassination. He's being questioned for long hours, but there is no stenographer present, and the police say there is no tape recorder in the room.
I'd like some legal representation, but these police officers have not allowed me to have any.
He's confessed to nothing. He has, in fact, denied any guilt to his only audience, the press and the spectators in the hallways.
I've been photographed in a t-shirt. Now they're taking me to the line up among these men. That's when he will be kicked out. Right?
Lee Harvey Oswald, while he was alive, in the strongest terms, denied he committed the crime.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
It would be hard to say that he shot Kennedy in some cause, as a politically inspired shooter would proclaim.
Come on, man. No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy. President.
He is about to be transferred to the county jail. The FBI has called the Dallas police on both Saturday and Sunday, warning them of threats to kill the alleged assassin of President Kennedy. The police have decided to proceed with the transfer anyway. As you watch, listen for the two car horns. One as Oswald emerges, and the other the moment before Jack Ruby fires.
He's been shot. He's been shot.
It was the shocking live murder of Lee Harvey Oswald that terminated the Dallas police as investigators. J. Edgar Hoover wrote a memo to the newly sworn-in President Johnson that evening, saying the thing I'm concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin. The day before, he had told Johnson that the case as it stands now isn't strong enough to be able to get a conviction. The next day, Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach wrote a memo to the White House saying the public must be satisfied that Oswald did not have Confederates who were still at large and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial. We need something to head off public speculation or congressional hearings of the wrong sort. With those two memos, the FBI became the main investigatory arm in the JFK case. There was never any serious discussion that independent investigators were needed. The idea in Washington now became to contain the crime to Oswald, therefore cutting off any connections to a wider Russia-Cuba communist conspiracy which could provoke the threat of atomic war. The day after he was murdered, the New York Times pronounced Oswald as the killer of President Kennedy. The Warren Commission concluded that Ruby shot Oswald acting alone. It was not premeditated or planned, and Ruby had no help entering the building.
People that have so much to gain and have such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
2 months after winning his appeal and being granted a new trial outside of Dallas, Jack Ruby was found riddled with cancer in his prison cell. He was placed in the hospital, and 1 month before his new trial was to begin, he died. The Warren Commission never exposed Ruby's connections to the mafia, the FBI, or with gun-running and gambling figures in Miami and Cuba.
On other parts of the case that the government put against Lee Oswald, obviously he was dead. He had no chance to have cross-examine witnesses. He had no lawyer appointed.
Right, these people have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything. Did you shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir.
Mark Lane, an attorney out of New York, tried to get legal representation for Lee Oswald. In fact, went to the commission and asked, can I represent Lee Oswald? And they denied it because, again, this is not a typical court hearing.
This commission has functioned in a fashion
which totally disregards the rights of the accused.
I can tell you from my experiences having tried several hundred cases to verdict and being responsible for thousands of cases as head of the criminal courts and running the Homicide Bureau, that I don't believe there's any courtroom in America where Oswald would have been convicted on the evidence that was presented before the Warren Commission.
I don't know if anybody is innocent. I know the case which has been presented against him is full of falsehoods and contradictions. And I know that right now in the office of the Dallas District Attorney is a paraffin test which shows that Lee Harvey Oswald did not fire a rifle on November 22nd, 1963. I know that because I have a photostatic copy of that rifle.